Good evening, my friends. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation, live here on the Tattooed Historians Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter pages. I really appreciate everyone tuning in this evening. It's been a while since we've had an interview. I think it's been like 2 weeks since we've had an interview on, but I'm really looking forward to tonight's interview. I actually wore my John Adams shirt for tonight. Some of you know that I'm a big fan. Tonight we have Willard Sterne Randall to come on to talk about his book, The Founder's Fortunes, How Money Shaped the Birth of America. This just came out recently from Penguin Random House, and I'm really excited to have him on. Willard Sterne Randall is a distinguished scholar in history and professor emeritus at Champlain College. As a biographer and lecturer, he specializes in the history of the founding era, and he has been featured on C-SPAN's Book Notes, History.com, History.net, and more. He has taught American history at John Cabot University in Rome and is a contributing editor to MGQ, the quarterly journal of military history, and so much more that we need to discuss about his background. Willard, thank you for being on this evening.
I'm glad to be. Thank you.
We were talking a lot offline, and I would love to rehash some of that as we go forward here. But I really appreciated receiving this copy of your book, and it really opened my eyes to some stuff that we're going to go over in the next hour about the founders of the nation and money and politics combining into one. Willard, tell us about your background as far as when did you first get involved in history? When was the spark created for you?
Well, my father loved history. He attempted to write it. He worked for a company where he could edit the company magazine, and he wrote articles and stuffed them in the magazine. But more than that, the latest books on history came into the house, and he would finish them, and I would pick them up. There was never any prohibition on my reading what he got because he was interested in things like the Battle of Gettysburg or George Washington. And I just got very interested in early American history. Also, I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, much of the time in Philadelphia, steeped in the local history, Ben Franklin this, Ben Franklin that, Betsy Ross, etc. Actually, I didn't get to see Betsy Ross's house ever. It's a heartbreak. But I was always reading history, and I started writing it as best I could, as early as I could. So by high school, I was already attempting to write history pieces. And as soon as high school was over, I went to work on a daily newspaper. I had a chance to work on a daily newspaper in Pottstown, and they had a column every week or so where I could do a history piece. So I just started writing them. At that time, there were still people around from the Spanish-American War, so I could go out and talk to somebody who was in a war in the last century, and would tell me all about that. I interviewed an awful lot of veterans and their families. But when we traveled as a family, it was often pile in the car. And it got to the point where, you're either going to a graveyard or a museum. And sometimes it was both. So I knew Gettysburg very well, but I also knew what whaling looked like at Mystic Seaport. I knew what it was like from the Confederate side because we would go to Richmond, Williamsburg before it was quite so crowded. But it was a natural thing in the household. So I always thought it was sort of a natural thing to do, to read and to try to write history. I did not set out to be a professional historian, and I didn't even go to college right out of high school. I wanted to write. So I got a chance to write on a daily paper, and that worked. I had 17 years in newspapers and magazines. But eventually I thought there's an awful lot of waste of somebody knowing so much history and having so much contact with it, not to be able to teach it. So I decided to take the plunge from journalism. I had a real break from a famous historian, Catherine Drinker Bowen, who thought I had a wonderful story. And William Franklin, the loyalist son of Benjamin Franklin, encouraged me to to apply for a small grant. She sponsored me. I got the grant, and I started to write about William Franklin. But I didn't even know about him if I hadn't been covering Trenton for the Philadelphia Bulletin, and I got curious about the governors of New Jersey. Now, that's an odd thing to be curious about, to look at it historically. And there's where I discovered that Benjamin Franklin had a Loyalist son. Nobody had written about him. Nobody had published a book or a monograph. So I cut my teeth on the Loyalists, finding out that was the most neglected part of the Revolution. So I've been writing about that era, I guess now for 40 years.
Wow. When you first got into writing, Willard, were there any big challenges that you faced with it, or did writing just come natural to you?
Well, it's never come naturally. I think Tom Fleming was a good friend of mine, Thomas V. Fleming. And he was one of the people who said, it's only going to get harder as you get older. It doesn't become easier because you become more demanding. You're aware of your limitations. You're aware of all the things that I'm always finding things that I don't know. So I haven't been in the position of having to repeat myself, because the surprise for me and for a lot of people is that until the last generation, nobody was paying attention to the Revolutionary War. And historians would tell you can't do that. It's impossible. There aren't enough records. But I was lucky to come along at the time when the federal government and universities began doing the papers of many of the founding generation. I mean, sometimes these projects would take longer than it had taken the founding fathers to write the letters. Some of them never even finished. But it was a blessing to run into that. When I decided to write about Benedict Arnold, it was right after the naval documents of the American Revolution came out, and I could go to the superintendent of documents office and get all 10 volumes free. So I've been lucky in my timing to coincide with this renewal of interest in the founding fathers.
Who was one of the first people of that era that really fascinated you?
Well, Benedict Arnold, because when Kenneth Roberts was still writing, I was a kid just beginning to read. And these were great stories. Oliver Wizzle about a Loyalist. I didn't know what a Loyalist was. I did find out very early that was a bad thing to be. And found out that I found out from my father that I didn't find out. I told my father there was a Loyalist in the family, and he was very upset with me. He thought it was that all the good guys were on the other side. And I just actually stumbled into it when I found one of the Loyalists in the family had been a commander of a regiment and became the royal governor of Prince Edward Island in exile. And I didn't know that if I hadn't gone to the Confederation Center there and found a shelf full of books about this person. And I remember I wrote home to my father, and I got a letter back. I knew I was in trouble because he had a letterhead that he only used when you were in trouble. And he sent it to me. He said, "You should, this is almost treason to talk about these people." And I thought, no, it's very interesting. And so I went looking for that as I went along and found the Adams family, the Quincy's, Washington. All of them had people who had been called Tories before. The only popular book was The Traitor and the Spy by James Thomas Flexner, but that was by an artist, and it was sympathetic. But there were no biographies. There were no archives that I could find of the Loyalists. Certainly no archives of Benedict Arnold. There still aren't. But you can go to Canada, where he went, and where an awful lot of people. John Adams said it, I think, best of all. He and Jefferson were sort of kicking it back and forth when they were old and friends again. And Jefferson, who do you think was on what side? And John Adams very rarely said anything briefly. But what he did say was 1/3 wanted independence, 1/3 wanted to be loyal to their king, and the other third depended on where the armies were. And I think that's a wonderful summation. And from my research, it's not far off the mark. But that means that up to 1/3 of Americans did not want independence, and they either left or they hid their heads.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in on the earliest research project on the Loyalists in the 1960s on the William Franklin book.
Mm-hmm.
But that led to Benedict Arnold, who was a military loyalist, which was a special category of baddie.
Right.
He'd been a patriot, he'd been a soldier, and then he winds up turning his coat on the other side. What made him do that? Mm-hmm. Well, I had read Kenneth Roberts, Rabble in Arms, Oliver Wizzle, and knew there were two sides of the story. But I decided really to get digging and document them. And it was really fascinating. Benedict Arnold took 5 years of my life and left me, I think, a lot wiser about the politics of the country at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you ever receive any kind of fallout from studying or writing about the Loyalists, especially Benedict Arnold? Did you ever get anything from like a speaking engagement where someone may have said something that was kind of like off color or something where it made you feel a little uncomfortable, or was it always kind of just because you have the documents to prove what you're writing about?
That's a wonderful question, and the answer may be a little funny. Okay. I didn't get much flack in the United States, but when I crossed the line into Canada, mm-hmm. and gave a talk at a high school in New Brunswick, where there was an historian from a local college, he was really incensed to come up there and talk about their history, that it was not our history, it was their history. Mm. I ran into this in a really odd place, and that was in France. My wife and I and our daughter lived over there while my wife ran a university program in France. So I got in with a group of veterans of World War II, French, British, etc., and was invited to a talk by a Scottish duke. And I was on the elevator with him on the way back down from the talk. He was in his kilts, and I guess he had 7 weapons concealed on his body somewhere. But so he wanted to know what I was interested in. And I said, well, I've just written a book about Benedict Arnold, the great American traitor. And he just bristled. He said, traitor, it's you lot that were the traitors. We were loyal to our king. Wow. I wanted to get off that elevator. But you know, it's good though. You get to see the different perspectives as you go around. Americans were curious, I think, more than anything else, and some of them wondered if there were things they didn't know about their family in the Revolution, because it was not something that most people advertised. The Sons of the Revolution certainly would not have admitted any Loyalist descendants. Right. But yeah. I think we need all the variety we can get to try to understand. That was a cataclysm. How do we survive it? That's why I'm still doing these books. Mm. The new book is Founders' Fortunes is basically who paid for it. How did the Americans pull that off? Mm. And lots of questions. Why did the French want to help us? We've been fighting them for over a century in North America. But an awful lot of basic questions never get asked if you get into this rut of a canon of what American history is, or what the Revolution was, or who are the good guys and the bad guys. And then you usually neglect the bad guys because you maybe figure nobody really wants to know. I want to know about the bad guys. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate the fact that in Founders' Fortunes, you go back decades before, because you have to, especially when it comes to land, as far as richness as owning land and other things and other properties and speculation, if you will, what we would consider later on. When you started to research this, Willard, and these stories started to come out for you as far as the idea of land speculation and such, and you've touched upon this with Washington and others. What were some of the key factors in this land speculation, as we would say today, in the 1760s and the French Indian War period?
I kept bumping into it with each of the people I wrote about. So I wrote about Jefferson and realized very early that nobody knew anything about his legal career, which was a failure. He had to give it up because nobody would pay him. And that would lead to part of this book by explaining that nobody had any money because they were not allowed to have any money because they couldn't have a bank and they couldn't have any American currency. But backing that up, you had people trading pretty much large chunks of land on paper. And then trying, when the 3 years or whatever it was ran out, that they had to settle it and they couldn't, they would try to fiddle it with a colonial secretary or something and get another crack at it. But everything west of the Alleghenies was up for speculation. And after about 1740, when the French began to come down in force from Canada and fortify the lakes and then the rivers, and really cut a line down the center of the continent. Americans, colonists, didn't have any idea where the end was. They didn't know where the Pacific was. Virginia had a sea-to-sea charter. What sea? I think they meant the Mississippi because it looked pretty wide to them. But all kidding aside, everybody wanted more land, and I think that was the great magnet that brought people to America in such large numbers. I also had to do some European history, and in Europe, in the 17th century, when the colonization got going, almost nobody could own land. It was the church, it was the nobility, and the nobility, if they didn't have a son, left more to the church. So the church, the only established church, the Catholic Church, owned about a third of Europe. So there was no way up for what we would call the commoner, the common man. And so people who have studied immigration say that one of the great factors was their discontent with their ability ever to own enough land so that they could divide it among their children and their children could prosper. And they couldn't get into the nobility unless they were a merchant and bribed somebody, and the odds were pretty long. Mm-hmm. So I think the great magnet for Europeans was land in the New World. And that only intensified after the great struggle between the French and the English was over. That went on from 1689, raiding down to Deerfield in Massachusetts, all the way through 1740. You get King George's War, and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French are raiding the coasts and the rivers. Benjamin Franklin has to build forts to protect his printing press. The Penns were Quakers. They did not believe. The Penns were not Quakers. The Quakers did not believe in war, even defense, and the Penns wouldn't spend any money to defend the Quakers. So Benjamin Franklin emerged as a leader long before the Revolution when he put together his own militia. Because the Penns wouldn't and the Quakers wouldn't. So he called a town meeting, basically, and got 1,200 names on a petition, and almost as many men showed up to form militias. And of course, Ben, being a businessman, sold them the guns and the gunpowder and anything else they needed, and then went off and borrowed artillery from other colonies. But he was Colonel Franklin before he was anything else. And it was to defend his property. That was a concept. Americans wanted land and they wanted protection. And when they couldn't get it from the crown, they began thinking about how to do it themselves. And when the crown saw that they were going to do it themselves, that's when you start getting close to the war.
How good of a businessman was Ben Franklin?
He was fantastic. he could smell an opportunity. For example, you have a picture of him with his leather apron and his wheelbarrow going around finding animal scraps to melt down for candles, or pushing the lever to run the roller over the type. Well, that's fine. That's what he wants, because most of what we know about Franklin until very recently, he wrote himself.
Mm-hmm.
His autobiography is immortal, but it's Ben Franklin according to Ben Franklin. Actually, it leaves out some pretty big elements. For example, Franklin didn't go to church. He was not opposed to religion. He wanted the time. He wanted the time, so he supported every church. And Deborah, his wife, went to the Anglican church and even helped them get a bell tower because he invented the lottery to raise the money. But he would stay home and do his tinkering on his experiments on Sunday. And he would then write about the experiments in his newspaper. Everything he did, he self-publicized. And then he was open-minded about religion. So an evangelist came to town, George Whitefield, who could, he could have his own channel on television. Beautiful voice, magnificent voice, handsome, long blonde hair, Oxford graduate and all of that. But he would come into town on a horse and another horse behind him with a folding pulpit on it and get a crowd. He was not allowed in most of the churches because he was more popular than the ministers and they didn't want him around. But when he got to Philadelphia, Franklin saw the biggest crowd he'd ever seen. And he'd heard that Whitefield could gather thousands of people. So what Franklin did is pure Franklin. He was also part mathematician. He walked around the periphery of the crowd. And then he did a little math and he figured out the average adult takes up 2.5 square feet in a crowd. So by doing a computation, he said, my God, there are 25,000 people here. Now, what he did with that was helped him become wealthy because he thought anybody who's going to draw a crowd like that can sell books. Franklin made his first fortune, or his fortune really, as a publisher. He signed up George Whitefield. Wherever Whitefield went, he published the sermons, whatever Whitefield wrote. Whitefield wrote 1/10 of all the published work in America within a very few years. And Franklin introduced books from England. He published Pamela in the United States for the first time, one of the very early novels. And he told printers back in England, send me anything that creates a rage. So he made his first fortune in printing, but he invested shrewdly in real estate. And he also was an entrepreneur in that he didn't try to keep all the money for himself. He set up partnerships with printers in the other big towns. He would print the pages. And then he also got to be postmaster and then postmaster general for the northern colonies. So he was sending his stuff free to other printers, and they had the heavy duty of binding it and selling it. So George Washington is in Williamsburg reading a book printed by Benjamin Franklin on how to be a young gentleman. He was all sorts of things, but he had a knack. And then he got the idea. People thought he was funny. I mean, he would just say off the cuff things, sort of pretending to be a country bumpkin. That was his shtick, shall we say. And that put him on the trail of Poor Richard's Almanac, which by any measure was the leading bestseller of the colonial era. He was selling up to 10,000 copies a year. If you factor that out with our population, he was selling about 1 million books a year. So wow. The income from that, he got the only high salary job from England, which was postmaster. And he kept that until they fired him over the revolution. But he kept building and building. By the time he was 45, he was making, in our money, about $300,000 a year, which in those days was a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a ton of money. That's amazing. When he is sitting with the others at the Continental Congress, he's not the only wealthy person there. We have this kind of idea that the founding fathers were kind of like these just average people, but they really were they were elite.
Well, they're a real mix.
Okay.
And I devoted a lot of Founders Fortunes to trying to say who was rich, who wasn't, who was rich for a while and then lost it.
Mhm.
And it's a real mosaic you get of pieces of different strata of people and their fortunes. John Hancock was one of the richest men in America because he inherited his uncle's business. But he also, like the ones who were making a lot of money, like Franklin, Hancock, Washington, they were diversifying. They were ahead of their times. They didn't get stuck with a single crop or a single product. John Hancock inherited the business of taking the whale oil from Nantucket to England so that they could light their lights and their stoves in the winter. And what Hancock did was, okay, John Hancock, when he got the business, let's take the whale oil over and sell it ships and all, buy some new ships, fill them with consumer goods that they can't get in America, because he noticed that almost any manufactured good that American wanted, they had to get from England. So Americans were really dependent on somebody like Hancock for needles and thread, for all sorts of practical things. And then what Hancock did was branch out. We would call it franchising. He would train a clerk how to run the business, and he'd open another store. To open another store, he needed builders. When ship builders couldn't be building ships because of seasonal work, he put them together building stores. So he had built a fortune outward by diversifying. So yes, he was very wealthy, and he took all his money in cash and stuffed it in a wagon and rode off to the Continental Congress because he believed that the United States could be a winner. Benjamin Franklin's land, his wealth was in land, and he's the one that put together, we would say, the wildest speculation in land. He wanted nothing less than what we would call the Midwest. The one land company he put together with his son, the royal governor, the Loyalist, also included high cabinet officials in England who wanted to buy in on it. But he wanted a land company that if the revolution hadn't come along, he would have gotten about 20 million acres of prime Midwest land. George Washington was not to be outdone. He wanted the Mississippi Valley. So he teamed up with the Lee family, and they found the Mississippi Company. At the Continental Congress, you had representatives of 9 major speculative land companies. But it was all speculation. Nobody had any cash. So what that led to, I think, is a lot of improvising. Now, you had some very poor people. You had a school teacher, always the poorest people in the room. You had somebody who fixed shoes in the season because he didn't have enough crops. In the Constitutional Convention, you had a congressman from New Hampshire. The first job he ever had was in Congress. Until then, he ran what we would call a corner convenience store. He wasn't wealthy, but these are the ones who were the believers. What they were in it for. What my book concludes is sort of the last line of the book is what they wanted was a free and independent country of their own. For some of them, money was very important. But some of those same people came a cropper because things changed so drastically. Robert Morris, the wealthiest man in America. I think the first billionaire, because I've tried to convert the money of their time into the money of our time. Every week, another privateering ship came in that he had built and owned, full of loot that he had taken from a British convoy and sold at auction. Fabulously wealthy. He wound up in debtor's prison for 3 years after the revolution. So I pay much more attention to how they got it and what they did with it for the revolution than how rich they were. I mean, many of these men took their last ship and gave it to George Washington for the nucleus of a navy. It's still called Washington's Navy. And then off went Robert Morris and other members of Congress and formed a Navy committee, got some money from Congress, sold some of their ships, built new ones until you had ships of frigate class in a very short time. And it was, these people they had ingenuity, and they also were risking everything. In the Declaration of Independence, the bottom line of the Declaration is we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Sure, they pledged their lives. If they were caught, as the Scottish lords in the Rising of 1745 had been, they were executed. Any of our founding fathers who went through the old entry to London passed between two posts that had crow's nests up top that were made out of the skulls of Scottish earls. So they knew the penalty if the revolution failed. But their fortunes, what were their fortunes? That's what I was after. Along the way, I sort of banged heads with some historians who for a long time have said they were only in it for the money. Well, what I've worked on is coming up with the evidence that says they're not, they weren't. Most of them, as Robert Morris said, were plain honest men. And they had to come up with new ideas. When there's no bank in America before the revolution, how do you run a revolution? How do you finance it? How do you get the King of England and his King of France and his courtiers to give you millions? What was in it for them? Well, they were clever. What they said, we have what France doesn't have. One thing we have that they don't have is tobacco. So my research led me down a side path into something called snuff. Snuff was powdered tobacco, very finely ground, and it was all the rage in Europe. There's a place on your hand, sort of behind the knuckle of the thumb. It's called the snuff box because they would get some of this fine powder, put it on that snuff box, and then snort it and then sneeze. That was their idea of a really good high. Poor people smoked tobacco. Wealthy people, the elite, snorted it. So the French loved it. The Queen of France loved it. The Queen of England had her own private snuff room at the palace. So it was a rage. And what I discovered because of Robert Morris was what he was after was the monopoly on selling tobacco to the French, who did not want to go on paying a lot of money to buy snuff from the English. It sounds like a small thing, but it was not.
I've actually known people who still do snuff, if you will. They prefer that rather than smoking it because you don't have the smoke. It's just
right.
You don't stink up your house with snuff. They would rather do that. Anthony is in the chat from YouTube. Thank you for being here, Anthony. Greens from Santa Cruz, California. How much did the slave trade generate wealth for them? We often hear about this with Jefferson, but he shouldn't be the only one we discuss on this issue.
Well, for them,
right.
The delegates at the Continental Congress, basically South Carolina and North Carolina, but mostly South Carolina, were adamant that there couldn't be anything in the Declaration of Independence about slavery. And in fact, Jefferson, who wrote it, wrote a very strong paragraph on blaming the English and the king for inflicting slavery on the American colonies. And at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia's delegates, that hit the cutting room floor. It's not in the Declaration of Independence, but it was. Some of them, like Jefferson could rationalize anything, and he couldn't figure out. I think that he couldn't square what he believed with what he could do. So he married a woman who appeared to be wealthy. Her father was a slave broker, and his timing was terrible because he imported a shipload of slaves and then died. And Jefferson had signed the association, which was a pledge of planters and businessmen not to buy or sell anything from England. This is just before the Revolution broke out. So here he is with 135 slaves. He also inherited slaves. He inherited some cash, a fair amount of cash, but he inherited all his father-in-law's debts, which were far more. And Jefferson never eventually tried to pay off all those debts because he could rationalize not paying them. And this is one of the fascinating things I think I stumbled on. Cornwallis, on his way to defeat at Yorktown, spent 10 days on 3 of Jefferson's farms, which meant they ate everything. And what they didn't eat, they burned or took with them. They took away all Jefferson's horses that were full grown to pull the wagons full of loot. And the horses that were too young, they slashed their throats. And that crossed the line with Thomas Jefferson. I think that one thing helps explain why he could get out of paying debts to the English that kept growing and growing and growing. Even when he got a good crop, he didn't put a dent in it. He also kept spending. I think he's the all-time spendthrift, compulsive shopping founding father. He loved good stuff. Look at Monticello. 54 years to finish a house because he kept making it grander and putting more into it. Right. But he rationalized that what the British had done to him and to other Americans meant we didn't owe them anything. So he died in debt. He didn't free his slaves. Even in his will, he only freed the Hemmings family, which is pretty famous. They were personal slaves. If slaves ran away, he didn't pursue them, whereas Washington did. If a slave ran away, he wanted a slave back. These people believed that the slaves were property. It took Washington a long time because of one servant, William Lee, and I have his picture in the book, who was his bodyguard, the fellow dragging the chains, surveying the wilderness, etc. It took him a long time to realize that this was an intelligent human being with a heart and soul like anybody else. But that was a little late. Washington was dying, and he hadn't freed his slaves in his lifetime. So it's the great conundrum to me that you can have slavery within a war for freedom. But they hadn't solved it yet, and they kept kicking it down the road in the Declaration of Independence. Cut it out. In the Constitutional Convention, we're going to be here all year at this rate. We're not agreeing on anything. We're going to have to soft-pedal this. Why don't we put it off for, say, 21 years? So that kicked it into the 19th century. And then Jefferson, when he was president, ended the importation of slaves. But by then, slave breeding in the United States, you didn't need to import slaves anymore. So it really took the Civil War to settle this, and I think that's one of the founders put it this way: slavery was always the snake curled under the American table, always ready to strike, and they couldn't resolve it. They didn't resolve it until they fought over it.
We talked about Robert Morris and some others, and a lot of people will actually be introduced to Robert Morris maybe for the first time in your book, because it's not a name we hear about a lot. And they talk about debtor's prison and etc. Who was made by the revolution? Did anyone come out on top? We know that some people ended up in debtor's prison. Did anyone come out ahead of the game, so to speak, by the time of, let's say, the Constitutional Convention or anything like that? Or
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander
Hamilton. We think we know everything about him if we've seen the play.
I've never seen it, so I don't.
It's wonderful, but it's a musical. Right. How do you have a whole Broadway play about the founding fathers and leave out Benjamin Franklin? Benjamin Franklin doesn't have a song or a dance. He would have wanted one. He was left out because Juan Miranda, who wrote the play, said, if you have Franklin in the play, he'll take over the whole thing. We can't have Franklin came out of it very, very well. A lot of his property was ruined, those rental properties, when the British occupied Philadelphia in the winter of 77, 78. An army was built into them, and that doesn't do very much for real estate. His own house was made headquarters of John Andre and the British Secret Service. And when Andre left, he took the Benjamin West oil portraits of Franklin and his wife off the wall and threw them up on the cart and took them off, and they hung in the family castle in Northumberland for another century or so. So Franklin lost a lot from looting. He had all these speculative plans, but this is the big thing I learned about all of this is Americans were land rich and cash poor. They all wanted land. They coveted it. They valued it for anything. But if nobody has any money to buy it, and nobody can pay the rent, what do you have? Well, you have military and political problems. Who came out of it on top? Hamilton is endlessly fascinating when you consider that, first of all, he only knew his father for a short time. His mother was divorced at a time when there was no divorce allowed. She'd been actually put in jail for refusing to have relations with her first husband, or her only legal husband. Hamilton was orphaned at 11. He had nothing. What he was supposed to get was taken by his mother's first husband and turned over to a brother that he didn't know. And he was the kid on the counting stool. He was right out of Dickens before Dickens. But he was so brilliant that one thing he figured out right away is who was the one to latch on to in a system that was very much like the Middle Ages, where you found a sponsor. If you had the right sponsor and you worked for that sponsor, again, almost like Charles Dickens, then you could find a way to advance. So he wanted to be a doctor because his best friend wanted to be a doctor. But I love it that the founder of the Treasury, our first Secretary of the Treasury, flunked math in college. Every time I do the checkbook, I chuckle. I don't feel so bad. But he looked around, and what he saw is he could think, he could write, and he could do it on his feet. He was courageous. I mean, here's a guy who took his literary discussion club and seized the cannon from a British fort while they're under fire from a British warship. And that caught the eye of George Washington. And he had the right father figure, George Washington, who had no sons. And there was something of a relationship, absolutely nothing more than patron and student with Washington and Hamilton, Washington and Lafayette, Washington and 29 promising young men who became the governors of many states, etc. But Hamilton was smart and dead honest, and Washington trusted him and turned over more and more responsibility. And so he was fearless. He had sort of the kind of sponsorship that it took to be able to come out with big ideas and not threaten Washington. And one of which was to set up banks. There were no banks. The British Currency Act of 1764 forbade banks or currency in the colonies, which meant people like Sam Adams' father went absolutely broke because he had set up a bank, and now the British said he had to pay all the money back. So Sam Adams' father was bankrupt. Sam Adams wound up waiting on tables at Harvard to finish, and he never forgave the English for that. But Sam Adams is one of the great revolutionaries of all time. He never had a nickel. He didn't care about nickels. He didn't care what he looked like. When he went to the Continental Congress with Hancock representing, they were on the run from the British at Lexington and Concord, and Hancock's got all the money and notes from his family fortune in the coach, and Sam Adams. And Hancock turns to Sam Adams and says, "You can't go to Congress representing Massachusetts looking like that," and insisted on buying him a new suit and hat. So my hat's off to Sam Adams, but money was never a motive for him. He was a revolutionary. He was also a troublemaker because he stirred up factions within Congress. He found friends in the South. He found people plotting against Washington, but he certainly wasn't in the money. Hamilton is the one who came up with such bright ideas on what to do about money that when Washington asked Robert Morris to be the first Secretary of the Treasury, Morris, who had been superintendent of finance for Congress before the Revolution, turned to Washington and said, "Get Hamilton. He knows all about it. Hamilton's the right one." And, Hamilton certainly wasn't in the money. He fiddled the office accounts a few times when he had a girlfriend, and that ruined his chances of ever being president. But he wasn't in it for the money. In fact, and after he was killed in the duel with Burr, Hamilton and his family had so little money, they had to take a collection to give him a funeral. So that they all went in debtor's prison. And that's the thing. You can't do class analysis on these people. They don't stand still long enough. They're not all in the same class. Their lives and their fortunes are up and down. But they stuck with the main point, which was to win independence and then figure out how to run a country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Willard, outside of this book, you wrote a book which is going to be fascinating for me to read, which is on my wish list, about how this truly doesn't end, so to speak, until the War of 1812. You brought out Unshackling America, how the War of 1812 truly ended the American Revolution in 2017. And talk to us about that, because I put a link in the comment section for everyone to go to the Founders' Fortunes, but they can also find this other work on here. And I've never considered that being the end of the American Revolutionary experience in any way. So can you go over how you came up with that thesis?
Sure. In a way, and I didn't plan it this way, in a way it connects with Robert Morris, because in the Treaty of Paris, we should have been able to trade with anybody afterward. We had independence, but both sides, neither side completely honored the treaty. So Americans who owed, like Jefferson, owed fortune to British merchants, would not pay their money, and because the English would only take it in silver and gold they didn't have. The British retaliated by making it impossible for Americans to carry out trade with any British territory, which meant Canada, and New England was left out to dry on that, or the Caribbean islands, or England itself. So all of a sudden the revolution is over, but we're being blockaded economically. And that's where that book goes and where it really comes from. It got to the point of an actual blockade under Jefferson, where if a ship entered harbor in New York, it was stopped by a British ship with a shot over the bow till it stopped and was searched to see if it was carrying anything from France, because England was at war in France again. But we were being treated again like colonies, and we had almost no trade. We had a very long depression after the revolution because of that. We had no credit left because we owed the Dutch and we owed the French and we owed everybody in sight. So it was a terrible recession. And people like Robert Morris, whose whole career was built on international trade, they had nothing, and they turned to more speculation. And he had deposits made using money that he'd already put deposits on for something else. The word is kiting. He was kiting real estate deeds, and he went broke. He was not the only one. And I looked at this because if the British had honored that treaty, or if we had paid our debts to the Loyalists, the British would have taken their troops home instead of leaving them on the Great Lakes and the Canadian border. I mean, we were on the edge of a war until the War of 1812. The British hadn't gone away. We were starving as this banana republic or string of banana republics for trade. And finally, Americans, apparently new Americans, an influx of Irish after the British brutally suppressed the revolution in Ireland in 1790s. A lot of Irish came over and headed west to Kentucky until Kentucky had 400,000 of the feistiest fighting people. And they were willing to take on the Native Americans. They take on Tecumseh. And the British, I have to say this, my English forebears would not be happy with me, but the British never learned to adapt. These are the guy with dresses and bagpipes who walk through the Khyber Pass while they're being shot at from all sides. But they don't adapt to the terrain, the customs, the practical situation. So they wouldn't heed the Indians. They wouldn't let the Indians help them. So it's a fascinating war for what could have happened, almost happened. And then the surprise was the Americans held out against the British when Napoleon couldn't. And that was the signal, I think, to the rest of the world that we'd become an international figure, international power. That these Americans at Baltimore, by the dawn's early light, when the British gave up wasting cannonballs and headed for New Orleans, where they heard there was even more loot and where they got mowed down in a matter of minutes, to the Battle of Lake Champlain, where they invaded from the north and were stopped dead by a lieutenant with a scratch navy. We won a series of battles that made us, I think, gave us international stature. That plus the British. The British never tried anything on us again. In fact, they wanted us from then on to be their allies. So that's a pivotal war to understand. And when it was all over, we did have actual independence because we had economic as well as political and military independence.
Mm-hmm. I've traveled and visited some of my friends up in Canada, and that's the war where we talk the most about. We don't talk about the revolution so much. We talk about the War of 1812 and that being a defining moment. And we pick on each other like, okay, we won, and it's no, we won, and
nobody won.
And it keeps going back and forth. Right?
Neither side lost. Both gained. We gained financial independence, and they came together as a nation for the first time with the French and the English on the same side, fighting on the same side against the Americans. And Canadian opposition to the Americans is the bedrock of Canada. They define themselves by what we're not or they don't want to be. To understand, but it comes out of that war.
That's right. Willard, I appreciate your time coming on this evening. Everybody, I've placed a link in the chat. You got to go get Founders Fortunes. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I'm learning how to center a book on here as well, because it's usually over here going. Founders Fortunes on Money Shaped the Birth of America. Willard, I really did enjoy this book a great deal, and I learned a lot. I didn't know a lot about Robert Morris and the after effects, the economic crisis after the revolution was really intriguing to me. And I really, really did enjoy your book.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming on, Willard. I know this is new for a lot of people to be on a live stream, but the times in which we live, we're doing new things, I guess. And I really appreciate you taking your time to be on here.
It's exciting, and it's a pleasure to meet you and your audience. It's a new treat.
Thank you, Willard. I hope everyone has a great evening. Please be safe. Take care of yourself. Hopefully we'll all be together soon at some kind of a live get together or something. I would really appreciate that. I hope you all have a fantastic evening, a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody. Please go follow the link in the chat to go get your copy of Willard's book. We'd greatly appreciate it. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.
Take care.